Hey everybody, Tim here, back for another update on the Chicago and Northwestern Harvard subdivision. First, I want to give a huge shout out to everyone that is watching this channel. The last video that I put out was easily the most watched video I've done so far. We've added over 100 additional subscribers since that video's come out, so sincerely, thank you. All that means a whole lot to me. I'm really glad you're enjoying the layout and the work in progress because, like I said last time, these videos really do help keep me motivated and staying on track with my hobby goals that I've set for myself. In fact, the response of this last video motivated me to move up my video plans. Last video I said my goal was to put out a video about once every 4 weeks, but now I'm just so pumped up and energized from everything. I'm going to try and actually put out videos every couple weeks just because of the work that I've been able to get done. There were a lot of good comments in the last episode, and one thing I will definitely be trying at some point that got mentioned is using the fine paint pens for parking and road markings instead of taping off and airbrushing everything. And then even when I do airbrush things, I'm definitely going to try. Another great suggestion was to do the matte coat once the tape is down to help prevent the paint from bleeding under the tape. And so thank you to everybody that made those suggestions because, again, this is the beta test version of my layout before I start building a permanent layout when my wife and I and our kids move in a year or two. And so I definitely want to be trying all of these techniques out to really figure out things before, again, I start working on the actual main permanent layout that I want to build. So, before I get into my layout progress, I want to ask a couple of questions and get your input on some things that I am hoping to be working on longer term. You know, not just this episode or the next video, but even longer than that. So, the first thing I need your input on is I need some vehicles for the layout. You know, cars, trucks, SUVs, you name it, for the parking lot at the Metra station. There's a few roads that I'll eventually be putting in, including an overpass next to the metro station. And so obviously I want to be able to populate those spaces with some vehicles. I haven't really found a ton of examples that I'm really thrilled with that are modern and fit in a 2010s era layout. Most examples I've found really fit in, like the 50s or 60s or 70s, maybe the 80s. So if you know of any really good examples that are more modern, I don't care if they're, die-cast kits, 3D printed, whatever, please leave a comment and let me know because I really want to start mapping out what I want to purchase to help get some more vehicles on the layout to help with those scenes. The second thing that I really want your input on is I'm putting together my to-do list of what I need to do to make sure that my locomotives and rolling stock fit in the world of the 2010s. And I'm not talking about, obviously weathering is definitely going to be important, especially for some of the older CNW rolling stock that I have. I'm talking about, what physical modifications do I need to make to either my locomotives or my rolling stock to make them fit in 2010. And I'll give you two examples of things that I already know I'm going to be doing. First, on my rolling stock, I know that I've got several pieces that I need to add the reflective striping on the sides to get up to date with regulations in the 2010s. And then for the locomotives, I know that I need to be slowly adding the PTC, the positive train control antenna setups on the locomotives. And again, I say slowly on this one because, it took the actual railroads up until around the year 2020 to fully get their fleet online. And so I'm not rushed, but it's definitely something that I've earmarked that, I need to order those parts and get that ready to do. But again, I want to know if I'm on the right track. Are there any other modifications that I need to be thinking of? Do you have any recommendations on where to get those things that I need? Again, I really appreciate your input. One of the best parts of this hobby and connecting on YouTube like this is a chance to tap into, everyone else's experience and wisdom. So again, I really appreciate your input. It means a lot. So that being said, let's talk about what I've been up to with the layout. The big task I wanted to complete next, since the last video I put out, was getting the basics of my stand-in for the Starline Factory online. And like I said in my last video, my goal is, not to make a faithful recreation of the Starline Factory yet, but to have it be close enough so that way it's a comparable footprint, and so I can focus on, again, building up my skills for when I work on this on the permanent layout. So the Starline Factory, I've mentioned in a few different videos here. It's a massive complex that sits right on the side of the tracks in real life Harvard, Illinois. It's been repurposed now. It's not an active factory anymore. In fact, it's now primarily known for hosting weddings and receptions and other events. But the exterior, though, is largely unchanged. The interesting challenge with this is it is long. It's nearly 560 feet long from the end of the parking lot to the other side. And if I bring that down to N scale, you're looking at 3.5 feet roughly of building, which is again pretty darn large. Most building kits are anywhere from 7 to 12 feet long, or 7 to 12 feet, 7 to 12 inches long, and so this is certainly much longer. Now, I don't think my plan wasn't to get quite as long as the real life Starline, but to get pretty darn close. So I knew I would have to, mix multiple kits though to get even in the ballpark there. So I started with the Walters Machine Shop kit, and I started with the front wall and the right wall. I would build as it would normally be on the kit, but to give this structure the length that I needed, I then glued the back wall next to the front wall to make a really long front section, and I used some styrene strips and some other pieces to reinforce that joint between the two pieces that I married together. And then my plan was I would then use 1 millimeter styrene to serve as a replacement back wall, since no one will see back there. That'll be right up flush against the backdrop pretty much. The roof will cover obviously the front side of it, and as you can see, I ran out to where I had this section sitting at the time in my garage, and I laid out just what this one part of it would look like. And as you can see from this clip alone, just those two sections put together made this longer than both of the building kits that I had put together in the last episode. So I was really happy. I thought that was a good start. I also had the hardwood furniture kit from Walters that I was going to use. And again, this had to look like a continuous building. So to make it look like that, I took the left wall of the machine shop and the right wall of the furniture kit, and I glued them together. Now it clipped some of the things on the machine shop, as you can see, but that wasn't a big deal because those things would be in the back where no one would be able to see them. But the window spots that you can see that get clipped from the furniture kit would be a problem because those are definitely in the visible portions of the model. So I glued some styrene to the back of the piece to serve as a base, and then I cut styrene strips and glued them in to fill in those areas where the windows should go. And I made it purposefully imperfect because I wanted to give an appearance that the building had evolved over time. Where the doors were, I wanted to have it be bricked over. Like they were modifying the building as the use and need for the Starline changed. After that, I laid out all the wall pieces for priming and painting. I wanted to practice more of a beige tan brick color. So I mixed Vallejo Air Sand Gray and Vallejo Air Wood for the bricks. After that, I taped off the brick sections on the furniture kit and sprayed the concrete edges. I used Vallejo Air Concrete, which was definitely a little darker than I anticipated, but I decided to roll with it because, again, I'm trying to experiment and use different colors and gauge my comfort with them. So my taping was not nearly as good as I thought. I think it was a little late that day when I did that, and I was a little more tired than I thought. So I did have to go back and fix a few spots, which I think is inevitable whenever you're doing something like this. But after that, after I got that fixed, I taped off the area for the windows on the machine shop kit because I goofed and I glued those on, not really thinking. And so then I got those painted up. I did a white for my window frames. I remembered for the other sections and hadn't glued the windows on, so I could just paint right there on the sprue. So I was able to paint them again, hassle free, and then get everything glued up and lined up for assembly. I did use additional styrene pieces and some leftover pieces from the kits to reinforce the longer walls and provide support for the roof pieces I'd be running in as well. And so, I got it on the layout and positioned it. I wanted to get some basic ground cover done around the structure before I hit a pausing point on this. My thought was that in this timeline, the Starline would actually be relatively vacant because in this timeline, there's not a road running just above the factory there. That's where the Milwaukee, Racine, and Troy is instead of a road, which means that it's got rail traffic on two different sides of it, and not really noise conducive for weddings and things like that. So because of that, I want it to be a little bit more derelict. The gravel access areas will be growing over with grass and shrubs and other things, and that's honestly not that far away from reality for the actual Starline. Even though it isn't, even though that is a building that's kept up and used for events, the backside of the building facing the tracks isn't that well kept up. In fact, there are even some trees growing back there, and so I plan on adding some trees in that little area to the layout in a future update. But with the first level of ground cover down, it's a good stopping point for this structure. I definitely have a lot more work to do. I need to do some paint touch ups, and then start adding some details to the structure, like the downspouts I need to put on. I need to install the smokestack because there is a smokestack on the real star line, and so I want that connection to be there. Obviously, weathering, around the windows and other spaces. I want to work on the roof details as well, get some vents and things up there. And to finish this up, again, something I want to remind as I close on this part of the update, again, this is not that close to the real star line, but it's roughly the same size, which is really what I'm going for. I just want this to have a similar footprint, uh, so that way, again, it's Harvard-like. That's the phrase I keep using, and also that way it's not just one long styrene brick sheet with some windows. There is some differentiation in there. It's not just one flat. There's some depth to the building, which was important for me too. So I'm happy with how it's turning out so far. I'm excited to see how much better it will look as I start to add those details that will give the space some life. But in the meantime, it's just really nice to have something that the trains are actually running past that's not just foam and corkboard. So that's the part I'm happiest about the most. Now you probably noticed in some of those ending clips there, um, that I've made some progress on the buildings that I had put up last time. And again, that's kind of my goal in each of these videos is to lay out some new work, right? In this case, the new work would be the Starline Factory, but then to go back and continue to work on the little pieces on stuff that I had put up previously, because we're never done, right? That's one of the golden rules of model railroading. So, um, one thing I wanted to practice and work on in particular is lighting the buildings because a number of the freight operations on the Harvard sub happen at night. And I'll talk more about that in the last part of this video when I give you an operations update. And so I want to be able to film that and operate on that a little bit. And so I wanted to do some lighting, but I didn't want every light to be on in these buildings, especially in the buildings behind the parking lot. I only wanted a few lights on because these are commercial; they're not residential spaces. So odds are, only a handful of people would be working into the night, and so I wanted that to be reflected in how I set up my lighting for these buildings. So I purchased a number of LEDs, the really small, the chip size LEDs from a website called Evan Designs. It's a website I've ordered from in the past for my Warhammer projects. They're really great. I highly recommend them. I'll put a link in the description. And while I'll definitely wire this stuff up to a normal 12-volt power supply in my future permanent layout, I didn't want to hassle with resistors for this one. So to keep it simple, I also ordered just a small 3-volt battery supply with hookups for just a couple bucks to use on this version of the layout. So I made sure to cover all the windows that I didn't want to have light coming out of with black cardstock. And then I taped down one of the chip lights just to do a quick test run. And I only want, on this particular building, I only want the bottom two windows in that building to have light coming out. And you can see that, when I did my first test, that even with that small chip size light, it's way too bright without making any adjustments. So what I did was I added an angled piece of styrene to the layout to deflect and minimize the direct lighting, and you can see that that alone had a really big impact and got the light much more to an amount that I wanted it to be. When I tested it again, I noticed there was still some building glow, because this plastic is only so thick, right? And so I blackened the styrene sheet to tone it down one more time and really liked how that ended up looking. When it was time, I drilled a hole inside the building, and then threaded the wiring through. The wire, I mean, it's really thin wire, obviously, but it's pretty rigid wire, and so it only really took a couple tries to thread it all the way through the 2 inches of foam and the plywood, and to get it, so it's in a position to be used. To be wired up underneath. And so I would like to reuse these lights. So I'm only using some masking tape to pin the lights in place because, again, really malleable on the wire. The weight is really, the tape's going to be sufficient. So, uh, but having the lighting also had the double of bonus of then it allowed me to glue down the roof pieces for these structures finally, because that was the main reason I hadn't glued the roof pieces on was I was waiting to get in and work on the lighting. And again, like the Starline, there's definitely still more to be done here with these buildings, and especially with the roof in particular. I started with a black undercoat and then did kind of a speckled black gray for the roof. But then the kit also comes with some brick wall pieces that go above the roof that help kind of separate the different compartments that I need to paint and install. I also want to get again some rooftop units, maybe some venting to put up there as well. But again, that'll come later, right? Those are examples of additional details that I want to work on, but that I can work on over time. So for wiring all the lights to the power and to make it easy to integrate the building lights, when I hook up my multiple sections of the layout, I've got terminal blocks for each section. So that way I only have to wire connections between the blocks, and the lights themselves are already, set up in a really prime spot and they're ready to go. And I'll show you more about that when I get to the next section, because when I was thinking of lighting, the main buildings I was thinking of weren't these structures behind the employee lot. It was about lighting the area around the Metra station, and we'll talk more about that next. So I had purchased several of the Atlas streetlight kits, some of the single and some of the double mast that were close enough to what's at the actual Harvard station. These wires were definitely not as rigid as the chip LED kits, but I was able to thread them through the holes I drilled after a few different tries. The goal was to have the double mast lights on the station side, like in real life, and then single mast lights on the opposite platform. After I glued those down and waited for them to dry, I started working on the interior lighting for the station itself. The big trick here was illuminating the room, but not having the light be so bright that it would show through the roof and other pieces as well. So I added various pieces of styrene and some black cardstock to help deflect and dim the light. And after a few tries, now again, I still haven't glued the roof down because there's still more interior work I want to do, but after a few tries, I felt I had gotten it to a good enough point, and now I just need to fill that room with some seats and other things to help make it so that it's not just an empty interior space. I need to get some heat shrink tubing and other things to finalize my wiring, but I did do some temporary connections up to the terminal so I could just see how it all looked. One word of caution about the Atlas lights: overall, I'm pretty happy with them, but they keep the insulation on the wire pretty much right up until the end of the wires, and with these, as thin and frail as they are, if when you go to strip that insulation off, if you're not careful, you'll just clip the wires straight up. So just one thing to be mindful of if you end up getting those lights. So for now, the wires are a bit of a mess. When I go to solder and add the heat shrink tubing and everything, I'll make sure to organize and clean that all up. I didn't wire all of the lights just to help minimize the clutter. It was starting to get really messy underneath. But I was glad that the exterior lights were noticeably brighter than the interior lights, because that's what I was going for. I do plan on putting a couple of chip LEDs in under the awning for the station to give it some exterior lighting, and then also to put a couple street lights and other exterior lights down near the employee lot and down near the Starline Factory as well, just so to have some continuity of lighting. But I'm happy, and I think this is a great start. It's hard to show on camera, but as I ran trains up and down the sections in the dark with just the layout lights on, it really looked and felt like the railfan videos of the actual trains running through the Harvard sub. So again, it was a good start on the lighting, and a good pausing point for now. And again, just overall, here's a clip that I had used in my December episode, and then if you jump to now and how things look in just a month, basically, I'm really happy with the progress I've been able to make. So the last thing that I want to talk about in this episode is to give an operations update, again, to keep our narrative moving into the early months of 2013. So in 2012, and this is true in real life, there was a pretty bad drought in the middle of the country that really impacted harvests, and also true to real life and true on this layout. By the 2010s, the Janesville yard, which is north of Harvard on this division, became really far too large for its actual operational needs, and so the Chicago Northwestern starts to use it more as a parking lot for mothballed locomotives and rolling stock. So, because of the downturn in harvest, the CNW finds itself running a lot of excess hoppers up to Janesville to help reduce congestion in Proviso and other nearby yards. But as global trade continues to recover from the housing crash of 2009, intermodal traffic really starts picking up again in the first quarter of 2013. And a lot of the well cars the CNW had been sitting idle up in Janesville. So recently, the Harvard sub has started to see consists running Harvard hoppers up to Janesville to store them, and then coming back down to Proviso doing bare table runs, meaning intermodal cars, but with no containers on them, so that way they can bring them back into service and start using them on intermodal trains again. But these runs are primarily happening at night to minimize conflicts with both the Metra trains and avoid conflicts with the 400. And speaking of the 400, again, this service kicked off in the back half of 2012. It's still only running up to Madison, but ridership is growing. Um, in my timeline, this is true in real life too. So in real life, on January 13th, 2013, number 12 Illinois played Wisconsin in Big Ten basketball up in Madison. So in the timeline of the layout, what I'm saying is that game set up an all-time high in weekend ridership for the 400 from people going up and then coming back down from the game. So by the end of January 2013, the CW is running 8 trains a day. They're running 4 up to Madison, 4 going down to Chicago. That's still less than the comparable Amtrak Hiawatha service. That service is running at least 12 daily trains, but they're pleased with the growth in ridership to the point where the CNW begins to lobby Wisconsin and Minnesota to accelerate their funding to renovate the rest of the line because they want to get up to the Twin Cities as quickly as they can. One other timeline change that I'm using in my world, the General Motors plant in Janesville never shut down. So, in addition to the general manifest and interchange traffic, we're also going to start to see a good amount of auto traffic on the line as well. But that's it for my operations update, and that's all for now for this video. So thanks again to everyone watching, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe. It helps the channel out a ton. Next time, I'm hoping to get that fourth and final scenic section built and the track laid down so I can run across all 4 sections. I also want to continue to get more scenery down in the layout, especially detailing, the buildings that I've been putting down in the last 2 episodes. So be sure to tune in next time, and thanks for watching.